All right, tonight we're not getting into a new book, but instead I want to preach on a particular subject that I think will be helpful to everyone that's in the church. So 2 Kings chapter number 6 is where we're going to be at. We're going to be in 2 Kings chapter number 6. We're going to look at a particular story, but we're going to use it to answer a question that in itself is more or less asked here in this passage. So 2 Kings chapter number 6, we're going to read the last several verses of this passage as we read a story here from the life of Elisha, one that you're probably at least a little bit familiar with. If you've never heard this story, then you'll be shocked to read what goes on in it. But if you know it, then you'll know why it's such a powerful story, because it's actually some pretty shocking things going on in this particular passage. So 2 Kings chapter number 6, verse 24. And it came to pass after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, gathered all his host and went up and besieged Samaria. And there was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until an ass's head was sold for 80 pieces of silver, and the fourth part of a cab of dove's dung for 5 pieces of silver. And the king of Israel was passing by upon the wall. There cried a woman unto him, saying, Help, my lord, O king. And he said, If the Lord do not help thee, whence shall I help thee? Out of the barn floor, or out of the winepress? And the king said unto her, What aileth thee? And she answered, This woman said unto me, Give thy son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son, and did eat him. And I said unto her on the next day, Give thy son, that we may eat him. And she hath hid her son. And it came to pass, when the king heard the words of the woman, that he rent his clothes, and he passed by upon the wall. And the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth within upon his flesh. Then he said, Go, do so and more also to me. God, do so and more also to me, if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, shall stand on him this day. But Elisha sat in his house, and the elders sat with him, and the king sent a man from before him. But ere the messenger came to him, he said to the elders, See ye how this son of a murderer hath sent to take away mine head? Look, when the messenger cometh, shut the door, and hold him fast at the door. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him? And while he yet talked with them, behold, the messenger came down unto him, and he said, Behold, this evil is of the Lord. What should I wait for the Lord any longer? I want to look at that phrase, why or what should I wait for the Lord any longer? But I want to look at it from a couple different perspectives. In the sense that this man's asking because he's blaming God for all of his problems. And he's wanting to know, why should I wait on God if God's the cause of my problems? But his question is one that all of us have probably asked at some point, even if we don't realize it. All of us have had times where we have a hard time waiting on God. And when the answer doesn't come at the exact moment we want, we get upset with God. And we get the idea, why should I wait any longer? God hasn't answered yet. So more or less, that is his question. The difference between him and you is that he's blaming God for his problems, and you typically, hopefully, don't do that. But I want to consider that, because I think one place where we severely lack as Christians, because this is a sign of maturity, is that we fail to wait on God. We always rush into things. We want decisions now. We want answers now. We want God to work now. And we don't understand that our God is an eternal God. He lives outside of time. The Bible said He inhabiteth eternity, meaning that He lives where time does not exist. So for Him, time is not even an issue. That's why one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day to Him. Because He can see a millisecond, that fraction of a second, as if it were a millennium, as if it were 1,000 years. He can look at that fraction of a second that you and I passes by like that, and to Him, He can see it in such great detail that it's as if it were 1,000 years. But for you, the other side of that is He can look across the vast span of time and see 1,000 years as if they're nothing. I mean, as if they're one day that just passed by like that. Because time is not an issue to God at all. There is no limits to him concerning time. He knows the end from the beginning. He sees it all. But for us, because we are not infinite, we are finite, we do have an expiration date, we have a harder time with that. So one of the greatest marks of maturity is when we do finally learn how to wait on God. I can even say of myself that one of the places where I could really look back and say, okay, God definitely brought me from a baby to where I am, is when I finally started to learn how to wait on Him and trust Him. It wasn't learning how to preach, it wasn't doing all this other stuff. It's when I got to a point where I just realized I don't have to worry about everything. I can trust God no matter how bad things get and just wait on Him. That is, to me, one of the greatest marks of someone's maturity. I strive to be more like that, and each of us should be. So concerning the word wait, I want to introduce this thought by mentioning one thing. That there are a few ways that is used in the Bible. This is not the first time that the word wait appears in the Bible, but it is the first time that it appears where we're being told to wait on God. The first time the word wait is ever used is all the way back in the book of Exodus, when God is talking about the idea of someone lying in wait. It's like a predator waiting for the prey to come by so it can attack. A hunter waiting for the deer to walk by so he can kill it. Up until Psalms, that's mostly the way the word is used. The majority of the times it's used is talking about someone waiting to capture someone. Like a hunter, sitting in the stand waiting for the deer to walk by. The other way that it's used up until this passage is the idea of service. Like a waiter, when you go to a restaurant, how they wait your table. Meaning that they serve your table. They give themselves to that. The way that it's used in the Bible is that it's talking about the priest of Levi waiting the ministry of the priest, doing the office of the priest, carrying out God's work. So that's actually the first time and the second time the word is ever used. It gives those two different definitions. So it's interesting to me because whenever we think of the word wait, we automatically think of this idea of just standing still and not doing anything. But actually the two times it's used, the multiple, about 25 times it's used before we get to this passage. It's actually a word meaning to be doing an action. You're waiting there at any moment ready to strike. You're hunting. The other one is that you're serving. But it's only when you get here to 2 Kings chapter 6 that God starts to use the word in a different way. And that's where He actually does start to mean standing still and waiting on God. Now, once you get to Psalms, that becomes the primary meaning of the word. That's the way He uses it every time. But I give you that because I think it is interesting to see that, to take in consideration how God uses the word and what it means. Now, the difference here and in the other places is here, it's obviously talking about sitting still, because in the other places He either says that they are lying in wait, meaning that they're a hunter waiting to capture their prey, or He says that they're waiting on the office of the priest, meaning that they're doing the job of the priest. So in those cases, the word wait is always that. But what I see here, to introduce this story a little bit, is this: the Sumerians have been surrounded by the Syrians. Syrians were some of the worst people who ever lived. You've heard me talk about them before, the way that they would torture and kill people. They're the ones I've talked about, that they would typically take a small child like the age of Josiah and they would peel the layers of skin off one by one until they saw how many it would take to kill him. They were incredibly wicked people. So Israel, or not Israel, but the Sumerians at this point are held up inside of their village, their city. They're surrounded by the Assyrians, and they're there so long. They're captured by the enemy for so long a period of time that it says the head of a donkey becomes so valuable because there is no food that someone would pay 80 pieces of silver just for the head of a donkey. Now, you imagine it, because silver, the value of it changes drastically across time. During Solomon's time, it was worth nothing. But in general, what you imagine 80 pieces of silver being worth right now is a pretty good idea of what 80 pieces of silver would have been like for them. Could you imagine going to the grocery store, walking up to Safanya and Colruyt and saying, look, I'm so hungry, I'll give you 80 pieces of silver if you just give me that scrap of meat over there and I'll scrape whatever meat's left on the bone. Because that's what you do with the head of a donkey. It's not covered in meat. There's just little meat attached to the bones. There's not much there to eat. But they were so desperate, they would pay 80 pieces of silver. They were paying a fortune just for this. But the thing that's probably a little more telling is they were paying 5 pieces of silver just for a quarter of a cup of dove dung, which is bird poop. I mean, it's like go ahead on the ground, scrape up a quarter cup of pigeon poop, because pigeons and dove are the same family, and then sell it to someone for 5 pieces of silver. That's what they were doing. That's how hungry they were. That's how desperate they were. And so you want to see desperation, that's a good picture of it. But nothing shows it more than what happens in the next verses, where you read a story of 2 mothers who are so desperate to eat, they're so starved to death, that one of them comes up with the most evil idea imaginable, and that is to boil their child and eat it. And the agreement is that if you boil yours today, I'll boil mine tomorrow, and we can both survive this way. That's the kind of desperation these people had reached. And they're so desperate, it's not just an idea, they actually do it. They actually go ahead and boil the child and eat him. I mean, you think about that, you just look back there at the babies. I've got 2 of them back there in the back of the church, and you tell me how desperate and how hungry and how evil you would have to reach. Because, I mean, at that point, even if you're desperate, it becomes evil, the idea of eating a child. And so that's what they would do, though. But then, to show you even one more step of how bad it wasn't just the common people who were affected. The king himself had become affected by this. You know, when you wear sackcloth, that is a sign of mourning, it is a sign of sorrow and repentance and all of those kind of things. So when it says the king is there on the wall, and when he rips his clothes, and they begin to notice that there's sackcloth attached to his skin, that means he has been in mourning for so long that his clothes has actually started to grow attached to him. When you think about that, how long do you have to wear the same clothes? How dirty do you have to get before your clothes actually starts to attach itself to your skin to the point where it becomes noticeably attached to your skin? I mean, just imagine a king getting to that place. He's so dirty, he's been wearing the same clothes for so long, he's been in mourning for so long that his clothes have actually grown attached to him. Because this is the condition of the city at this point. Now, if you go to the next chapter, you'll see the 4 lepers who are sitting outside of the city, that they have given up hope completely. And they're willing, they say, you know, at least if I give myself to the Syrians, there's a chance that maybe they'll have mercy, or at least they'll just kill me and put me out of my misery. I mean, we're talking about some of the most violent and wicked people that ever lived. They thought they had more hope at their hands than they did sitting and waiting for leprosy to kill them or starvation. That's the kind of desperation this city had reached. And so when this man asked the question, and he blames God for all of this, and he asked the question, why wait on God any longer, you understand that this is not a small statement. That these are people that are so hungry that, like I said, they're resulting to eating children, they're resulting to giving a fortune just to eat a quarter of a cup of bird poop. I mean, all this kind of stuff. And that's the place they've reached. So when this man says, why should I wait on God any longer, it is a serious statement. But I think for you and I, we have to consider this same idea as well, because while our situation has probably never been that severe, most people in this room have never reached a place where your life was that desperate. You needed to hear from God right now, or else all else is lost. Now, there's times we feel that way. I mean, when Lori was getting her visa so that she could come over to America, and we had the wedding, most of you know the story, we had already had a wedding scheduled, paid for, planned, everything, and she didn't get the visa until the very last possible minute so that she could get on an airplane and get to America on time for a wedding. I mean, you know, it's a pretty desperate situation, but it's not as bad as someone having to resort to the point of eating their children. You think of stories like Lazarus, where Jesus, knowing that Lazarus is sick, he doesn't come even while he's sick. He waits until Lazarus is dead, and then he tells his disciples, let's go because Lazarus is sleeping. And the Bible defines that he knew Lazarus was dead, and that's what he meant when he said sleeping. And so you see that he waited till then. But he also timed his journey so that he would not show up the first day, the second day, or the third day, but on the 4th day. And if you know Jewish tradition, this adds something, you don't find this necessarily from the Bible, but it does add another layer to the story. So you can take it or leave it, because again, you don't find this directly in the Bible. But if you know Jewish tradition, the Pharisees, one of the things they believed was the idea that on the first, second, or third day, a body could still raise from the dead. That was their way of allowing for people who were in comas and those kind of things who just kind of woke up, because it was quite common. And so they were willing to believe that. But the 4th day, their superstition said that not even God could raise a man from the dead. And so when you get to this point where this is the fourth day, I mean, Jesus waited to the point where literally for them all hope was lost. It was finished. God couldn't even help them anymore. That's the place He waited for them to get to before He showed up. So many times in our lives, we get ourselves in these situations where we're waiting for God, we're even somewhat desperate, and it seems like God's not answering. And so we get to the place where we ask the question, why should I wait on God any longer? And so we decide to take matters into our hands and do things our way. And this story, if anything else, if nothing else, this story should help us to learn why we should wait on God longer. Why we shouldn't decide, okay, I have to make a decision now. Why we should be willing to trust God and wait, even when sometimes it's the third, fourth day. Sometimes it may be the fifth day. Sometimes it may be 6 months past when you thought the answer had to come. But I say we as Christians, we have to learn to trust God in all of these situations. So I actually want to go back to something the king had said back in verse number 27. Back in verse 27. The king, I don't think he even realized what he was saying, but he actually gives an incredible spiritual truth with what he says. The king says in verse 27, and he said, if the Lord do not help thee, whence shall I help thee? Out of the barn floor or out of the winepress? So when he heard this lady cry, "O king, help me," of course he figures she just wants food, she wants water, she wants something, just like everybody else in the city. She's desperate. And so she saw the king and she yelled. That's what he was expecting. But his question back to her is, if God doesn't help you, what do you expect me to do? Now for him, I do not believe that he was realizing what he was saying when he said that. But that is an incredible spiritual truth. If God doesn't help you, what can the king do? What can anybody do? Is there anybody on this earth that could do something for you if God's not doing something for you? That's why I think we as Christians, we waste so much our ability we have in prayer, that we can go to God in prayer and talk to Him, because we're so busy trying to find out how to fix this ourselves, how to do it our way, how I can save a little money here and do a little bit there, and eventually I can make it all work on my own. And we do all of that, but yet we don't really seriously take it to God in prayer and trust Him with it. We're still trying to make sure that we somehow have our hands in this, and we somehow are trying to make it work. Now, I'm not discouraging you from doing your part, whatever God tells you to do. But I'm talking about this idea that we say we pray about it, we say we trust God, and yet we consistently worry about it. We're always afraid of what's going to happen. And so we even sometimes step outside of God's will and start taking on things that God didn't tell us to do. I mean, I know people that they go and they buy houses, and I'm not talking about anybody in this room tonight before anybody gets the wrong idea, but they go and they buy houses, and then they realize that they've bit off more than they can chew. They have more debt than they know what to do with. And so they pick up an extra job and they do all these extra things, and I see them get out of church because they get so busy trying to make money to pay for the bad decisions that they've made, instead of simply turning to God and trusting Him. Because I can say, just as we saw Sunday night, I've never seen the righteous forsaken nor God's seed begging bread. God does take care of me in every step. But it does require that I sincerely trust Him and follow Him. But I want you to ask yourself that question. If God doesn't help you, what could you actually do that would be more powerful than what He does? I mean, that's why you have to consider it whether you're really taking your problems to Him in prayer or not. That's why you have to really consider, are you trusting Him or not? Because if God doesn't help you, what are you going to do? I mean, how could you ever be more powerful than Him? How could you ever do more than God could do? That's why that saying that you can do no more than to pray is an absolute truth. That there is nothing more powerful you could do to fix your situation than to actually put it into the hands of a living God. But instead, we have this human mindset that somehow I have to do this and I have to do this because society has taught that this is just the way it's supposed to be. And so we get so caught up in these things that we forget all about faith. We forget all about prayer. We forget all about God's will. We forget all about these things. And we start trying to do this the way that the world has taught us to do it. And we wind up trusting ourselves instead of God. So I want you to really ask yourself the question tonight. When you're in those kind of situations, and you want to know why should you wait any longer on God? Well, what can you do more if God doesn't answer? If God doesn't answer you, your things you do are going to cause trouble. I always like the proverb that says that the blessing of the Lord is good and adds no sorrow with it. Have you ever noticed when you start trying to do things your way, that things just seem to get worse and worse? The burden gets heavier. You know, you have extra debt to pay, so you pick up the second job and you start trying to do all this stuff, and you find yourself getting in deeper and deeper. You know, you get further away from family, you get further away from friends. All the things you were trying to accomplish actually get worse. Have you ever noticed that sometimes you get the idea that, you know, there's something you want to do, there's something you're worried about, and so you start taking the matter into your own hands, trying to fix it, and you start making it worse. I mean, you think about it, sometimes you have someone who's upset with you, and your idea is, oh, I got to fix this, I got to fix this, and so you start sending a message after message after message after message, instead of praying and talking to God and asking Him to deal with their heart. And what happens is you wind up pushing them away. You wind up making them mad at you because you won't leave them alone and give them time. You won't give God time to work in their hearts. So many times we want an answer now, and so we try to force someone to make a decision now, and what we wind up doing is forcing them to make the decision opposite of what they probably wanted to, just because we forced their hands. What I'm saying is, so many times we are the cause of the problem. Because we're trying to do it our way, we're trying to force things to go forward the way we want them to, instead of truly trusting in God. I mean, you understand when it says that without faith it's impossible to please God, that He really means that. That's not just a casual statement. You realize how many times God says the just shall live by his faith? It's one of the more quoted Old Testament verses in the New Testament. I mean, Paul uses that quite a few times to remind us that a saved person should be living by faith. That we should be trusting God, because it really is a sincere question. And I really want you to consider it tonight. Not to just let it go in one ear and out the other. But if you want to know why you should wait longer on God, well, what more can you do if God doesn't answer? I mean, all you're going to do is mess it up. You start doing it your way. I mean, there's a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. The end thereof are the ways of destruction. When you start trying to go your way, you are going to eventually get in trouble. You may be smart enough to get by for a little while. I mean, you may be able to get by for a time, but eventually when we start doing things our way instead of waiting on God, we get in trouble. And that's what you see in this story, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I want to deal a little bit more on this idea of if God doesn't answer, what can I do more? You know, if God doesn't answer, what is the king going to do? What is the president going to do? What is anybody going to do if God's not willing to do something about it? If God is not willing to change your situation, do you honestly think you can change it? I mean, you're going to mess it up. You'll make it worse, but you're not going to make it better. If God's not willing to do something about the problem, do you really think that you somehow can fix it? That's the question I want you to ask yourself tonight. And so I want to give you a few verses from the book of Psalms, because if there's anybody who understood this situation, it was David. That's why I encourage Christians to read the book of Psalms, because if you want to see something that will help you grow, I understand that David was like an emotional roller coaster going up and down every 5 seconds. From one chapter to the next. I mean, he's up and down from the beginning of the chapter to the end. But at the end of the day, if there's one person who in the Bible really seems to have got this idea of waiting on God, it was David. I mean, you talk about somebody who's willing to wait. I mean, he's anointed as king when he's a young man. He's anointed as king when he's still just a teenager. And yet he's willing to wait until he's a grown man to be king because he trusted God. Now, he may have had low points, but he trusted God. And even when he did mess up and take it into his own hands, like when he caught Saul and he cut the skirt off of Saul's robe, he even repented of that and said, I shouldn't have done that. I should not have touched God's anointed. God said not to do that, and I was wrong. And he apologized to Saul. He had the ability to kill Saul and end it right now. But he trusted that God's ways are truly higher than our ways. And if God wanted him to wait, it was better to wait. But we get this idea that I need it now. I mean, he's already anointed king. He's already been chosen and appointed by God. He has everything he needs to be king. In our eyes, he has every right to go ahead and cut Saul's head off and take the throne. I mean, what more can you ask for than God saying, hey, look, all right, I anoint you as king. I mean, once God's anointed you, it's not that you're the next king. I mean, you're ready to be king. I mean, you're anointed by God right now. You're not waiting on anything except for God to remove the old king and put you on the throne. So if that's the case, if we want to take it in our hands, the idea is go cut off Saul's head and take it. Because that's the only thing you're waiting on. But David waited and he trusted God, and he waited and he trusted God. That's exactly what he felt like he should do. And you see through that if anybody understands what I'm talking about tonight, it was David. So I want to see some of the things he has to say about this. Psalm 39 verse 6 and 7 says, "Surely man walketh in a vain show. Surely they are disquieted in vain. He heapeth up riches, and knoweth not who shall gather them." What he's saying in that verse, that's verse 6. What he's saying in that verse is that every man is walking in vain. Meaning our walk and what we're trying to do, the way we're trying to get through life and do it our way, is empty, it has no value, it's worthless. And he says man's ways are worthless. He says what we do is we disquiet ourselves. We get upset, we get bitter, we cry about it, we complain about it, we fuss about it, we get mad about it. But it's for nothing. That's what he says next. He says we disquiet ourselves for nothing. He says what we're doing is empty, and when we get upset about it, it's also empty, it's for nothing. He says we heap together riches. We pile up and we prepare. I mean, think of what, I believe it was Solomon who said this as opposed to David. He said that the rich man, that his safety in the day of trouble, his strong city, is his riches. But they do not profit him in the day of trouble, because riches cannot help you. I mean, you think about this. How many rich people, their family, when they got cancer, they spent everything they had to try to fix it, and they still couldn't do a thing about it? How many people who had bank accounts so full that they didn't know what to do with it all, when real trouble come, it could not save them. It couldn't stop them from the car accident. It couldn't stop them from the cancer. It couldn't actually fix anything. Money can only do so much. And he says they heap them together and they don't even realize who's going to gather them. Meaning that when they do finally die, they don't even know who's going to get it. They spend all their life on trying to build up treasures on this earth. They spend all their life trying to walk according to the way this world has presented, trying to do it man's way, to build up a safety net so that if anything happens, you'll always have a little money to fall back on. And I am for people saving, but I'm not for you trusting in your riches to save you. I am for you being wise enough to save so that when you need the money to go buy something, you can go buy it and you don't have to go in debt for it. It's not good to go in debt. That I am for. But I am not for you trusting in your riches to be your savior. You should be saving them, not them saving you. They are there as a tool to be used, not as something for you to truly put your trust in. I mean, just like if you have mutuality, I do hope you're not trusting your mutuality to keep you healthy, but instead you trust in a holy God. I mean, if you have, for example, I come from a country, in fact, the part of the country I come from, most everybody has guns all over their house. But if they're trusting those guns to protect them and not God, then they're wrong. There's nothing wrong with owning the gun. The problem is when you trust the gun and not God. There's nothing wrong with having insurance. The problem is when your confidence is in the insurance and not God. There's nothing wrong with having money. It's when the confidence is in the money and not God. But we get this idea that if I just have a job, if I just have this big of a salary, if I just have this much money in the bank, then I'm going to be happy, everything's going to be okay, nothing will ever go wrong because I have the ability to buy my way out of it. But money only goes so far. How many rich people were in that city? I mean, the king is affected by this. The king is starving. How many rich people do you think were starving when the trouble really come? Their riches didn't help them. I mean, yeah, maybe they got a few donkey heads along the way, but that's about all they got out of this. There was no true help for them in riches. The point is, true help comes from God. David said this one, I always like this. He said, the horse is prepared for the day of battle, some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, but I will put my trust in the name of the Lord. Solomon said the horse is prepared for the day of battle. But safety is of the Lord. And so you see both of them have the same thought. Father and son, they both had their head in the same place. That you can prepare the horse, you can get ready for war, and when you go to war, safety is of God. It's up to God whether you win the fight or not. David was saying some of you may trust in your horses, you may trust in your chariots, you may trust in your weapons and all this stuff, but I will put my trust in the name of the Lord. So what he's teaching throughout this passage, throughout this verse that I just read to you, is a very simple idea, and that is this, that the way man lives his life is vain. This idea that if you just have a certain education, you just have a certain income, you just have a certain, whatever it is, that you're going to be safe. There'll be no more problems in life. It's going to be all right. I finally reached the place where I can sit down and rest. He says repeatedly in the Bible that one day when the real trouble comes, your riches will not be there to help you. It doesn't matter, when the real trouble comes, it won't matter whether you have doctor in front of your name or not. When the real trouble comes, it won't matter most of that stuff that society tells you to trust in. You have to learn to trust in God. And so that's why in verse 7, the next verse, he says, I will trust in the Lord. I will wait on Him. And so what you find in this is that for you and I, the way that society has taught us to prepare, the way society has taught us to deal with desperate situations, God says is empty. He says it's worthless, and when they get upset about things and they start complaining, it's worthless because there's nothing that they can do about it in their power. Which brings me to what David says in Psalm 69. In Psalm 69 and verse 3, he says, I am weary of crying, my throat is dried, mine eyes fail while I wait for my God. David is talking about, this is where he had to learn this lesson himself. He's told us the problem with other people, but now he's telling us where he had to learn this lesson himself. He says, I've cried so much that my throat is dried out. My throat is sore because of all the crying that I have done while I'm sitting here waiting on God. That's what he introduced us to this thought with. Then if you go down a few verses to verse 6, he says, Let not them that wait on thee, O Lord of hosts, be ashamed for my sake. What he means, that's just part of the verse, but when he says, for my sake, let not them that wait on the Lord be ashamed, what he's saying is this, because I'm waiting on you. And I've sat here and I've cried and I've worked myself into a problem to the point, I've been so upset about this that I've caused my eyes to swell, my throat to be sore. And he's saying, God, please don't let me, be waiting for nothing. I've been waiting on you and I've been crying, but please don't let me wait for nothing. He said, don't let me be ashamed. That's meaning to not be disappointed, not to be, that everybody's watched me. I said I'm trusting in God, and then God doesn't show up. That's kind of the idea that he's speaking about. So you're seeing where David's learning that lesson himself, but he answers this again when he says in Psalm 25 and verse 3, Yea, let none that wait on thee be ashamed. Let them be ashamed which transgress without causes. You see what he's saying is this, the ones who wait on God, David says, don't let them be ashamed. You don't be ashamed that you're waiting on God. Don't sit back and think, oh man, everybody else is doing good and everybody else is doing fine and I'm over here and life hasn't gotten better and I'm trusting God and He still hasn't answered yet. I mean, don't be Mary and Martha that, you said you were trusting Jesus to show up and then He didn't show up and so now you're upset with Him. Because that's what they did. I mean, when they got there, they rebuked Him because they said, if you had been here, our brother would have not died. He would still be alive. They were ashamed. They were ashamed that they had waited on Him. They were disappointed. They had waited on God, and then they were disappointed because they didn't think God showed up for them when they waited on Him. And David is encouraging every Christian, every believer, that when it comes to God, he said, don't let them be ashamed. So when he says, for my sake, you can read two things out of that. Either he's using himself as an example of someone that even though he waited and cried so long that he made himself sick, and God finally came through for him, or he's saying for my sake because he doesn't want to be made ashamed. He wants to see God show up and work. But either way, there is a spiritual truth for you and I to take away from that. And that's that you and I don't have to be ashamed that we're waiting on God. If you're holding out a little bit longer to make sure the job is from God and not just the first offer that was given to you, you don't have to be ashamed no matter what somebody says to you. If you're holding out for God and everybody else is making fun of you because we got this and we have, you're waiting on God and you're not married yet, you're waiting on God, and you don't have kids, you're waiting on God, and you don't have a car, you're waiting on God, and you don't own some big $400,000 home, 400,000 euro home, you're waiting on God and you don't have all these things, he said, don't be ashamed of that. He says everything that they're trying to do, they're trying to heap all these riches together, and they don't even know what's going to happen to them after they die. And you're going to let them make you ashamed because you're doing the spiritual thing of trusting God and waiting on God. What could they do more than what God can do? Because their riches and their treasures and all these things will not help them when real trouble comes. When real trials and heartache come, when their child gets sick and they're in the hospital, and even though money might be able to buy the best medicine in this world, it will probably not help them in the day of adversity. That God is the real help that we need to look to. That's what he's trying to teach us throughout all of this. But Psalm 25 doesn't stop there. In verse 5 he says, lead me in thy truth and teach me, for thou art the God of my salvation. On thee do I wait all the day. He's saying the one who can save me is God. So teach me to trust God. Teach me to wait on God. Teach me to lean on Him because He is the God of my salvation. If there's anybody who can help you in the greatest of troubles, it is God. Then he says in Psalm 25, verse 21, let integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I will wait on thee. So he's saying, let me do the right thing. I mean, integrity, that's that part of you that guides you to do the right thing no matter who's looking. Uprightness is you trying to live upright. It's you trying to do the right thing. And so he's saying, let my integrity, that part of me that drives me to do the right thing, and my willingness to do the right thing, my uprightness, let that preserve me. Let that keep me from falling victim to what other people do and eventually giving up on God. Let me continue to wait on you. Let me continue to trust God no matter how things actually go. Even if it looks desperate, even if the situation looks impossible, let me learn to trust God and wait on God. Because that's one of the great problems we have, is that we just don't do that. When problems come, we give God 5-10 minutes, and if He doesn't show up, then we have to take it into our hands. We have to fix it. But that's not faith, and without faith, it is impossible to please God. Anything that's not of faith is sin in the eyes of God. And so according to God, not only is it not faith, but it would be sin then, because anything that's not of faith is sin. So for you and I to not wait on God, to not be willing to do the right thing and just stand right and do right and trust Him to work it all out, He says it's sin in the eyes of God. I mean, it's a simple thought. And then I give you one more psalm. He says in Psalm 37 and verse 7, rest in the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in the way, because of him that prospereth in the way. I'll just stop that part of the verse. What I want you to see in this is that for you and I, when it comes to not being ashamed, when it comes to holding fast and doing the right thing, staying faithful to God and trusting Him no matter how desperate the situation is, there's one more thought I really like that I see in there, and that thought is this. He says, don't fret yourself. Fretting yourself is when you sit back and you get bothered about it. When you sit back and you look at all these other people that seem to be prospering. You're trusting God, you're waiting on God. You're waiting on... I'll use myself as an example. I got married at 27 years old, almost 28. I sat back, I watched all my friends from school get married. I watched all this go on. And here I am, I'm thinking, I'm waiting on a godly woman. I'm waiting to find the right wife. I'm trying not to rush. I'm trying to trust God. And I'm watching all these people just rush into marriage. And there's a part of you that frets because of that. You get upset because you're trying to wait on God and get married in His time. And you see all these people who are just rushing into marriage, and they're getting married and they're having kids. And again, if you know me, that was my great desire in life, was to be a husband and father. I mean, from the time I was Josiah's age, as far back as I can remember, that was the thing that I wanted. I didn't want to be Superman. I didn't want to be the police officer. I wanted to be a father and a husband. And so for me to grow up to that point, because I understand, that's not that old, but you feel that way when you're watching all your friends come along and get married. Now I understand in Belgium, people may wait a little bit longer. So let me put it would be like being 33 and getting married. And so you're at that point where you're waiting, you're trusting, and you've been faithful to God. I started preaching at 15, and there I was getting pretty close to 30 myself. And I've been waiting on God this whole time. And of course it bothers you sometimes. You sit back and you wonder, what's wrong with me? That they're getting married, they're finding wives. But you know what I also see? I look back and I have no question that I married the woman God has for me. I have no question that I married, just the perfect woman for me. But I look back on so many of the ones, even the ones that seemed like they were good. The ones that I was like, oh yeah, I'm glad for them, that they wound up together. And so many of them are divorced right now. So many of them, their lives have been broken. And I honestly believe that a lot of it's because I look at them and they've rushed into things. They didn't really trust God even after they got married. They did it their way, and things started to fall apart. I'm not trying to say that in a critical or mean way, but that's what I noticed sitting back and watching them from a distance. And so God says, don't fret yourself. Don't sit back and be envious and upset because, here I am, I'm trying to serve God. And my neighbor down the street, he looks like he's really living it up. He's got a big house, a nice car. He looks like he's always wearing the nicest, newest clothes. And I'm over here just barely getting by. And what you don't know is your neighbor probably is in debt up to his eyeballs and is just about suicidal because of all the weight that's on his shoulder from it. You don't realize what he's actually going through to get that there is no peace, there is no joy. But the blessing of the Lord is good. It adds no sorrow with it. You see, you don't have to fret yourself because of what other people have. You don't have to sit back and be envious of it or upset about it, Because when God gives something, there is no sorrow added with it. When God gives something, it's good. Now, you may bring problems into it, but it is not the problem. Because what God gives is good. And so what I say of that is that when we look at this and we look at what we try to learn from David's example, is that you and I don't have to be ashamed that we're sitting back and waiting on God. We don't have to sit back and get bothered because I'm waiting on God and it seems like everybody else is getting the thing that I'm waiting for. In fact, let me illustrate it this way. Aura will understand this better than anybody. She was at the embassy the other day, and she waited in line, and people who come in after her were getting their numbers called, and they were getting to go forward. And she's sitting there waiting on her number. She had her appointment. Everything she could do, she did it, and yet all these people who just walked in after her are going before her. Do you think that didn't fret her? If you think that didn't fret her, that didn't bother her, then you've never waited in line. Because when you're waiting in line to get your number called, and you're sitting there, and all these people who come in after you are getting to go before you, even though you made an appointment, you called ahead, you did everything you could do to make the transition go smoothly, and yet somehow you're sitting here and everybody else is going before you. I mean, you got people who just walked in the door and they're already going up to the counter, and you've been sitting here for 3 hours waiting for your number to be called. You tell me that doesn't bother you? It does. If it doesn't bother you, then you're a better person than I will ever be. But it bothers us. But he's saying when it comes to waiting on God, trusting God, waiting on Him to show you what job does He want you to do? What does He want you to study? What does He actually want you to be? Where does He want you to live? Who does He want you to marry? How is He going to meet this need? How is He going to fix this problem in your life? How is He going to help you out of this situation? We want answers right now, but we have to learn to wait on Him. Because you and I have to realize, what can you do if God doesn't do something? I mean, some of you are in hard situations. You have things that you're trying to figure out. But what are you going to do if He doesn't answer? I mean, Eli just got his job, but if he would have decided, okay, well, I'm not going to wait on God to answer. If He doesn't answer, I'll take it into my hands. You know what he'd wind up with? He'd wind up with a job in Ipper, an hour and a half away, that he's miserable working at, like somebody else I know. He would wind up like so many other people that they get jobs and then immediately quit them. And you'd be surprised at how many people I've just talked about in that one statement. That they think if I could just have this one job, I'd be happy. And then they get it and they get rid of it just as quick because nothing's ever going to make them happy. Because they're not waiting on God. They're not trusting God. They're trying to do it their way. They think, well, if I could leave Belgium, I could leave Romania, I could leave the Netherlands, wherever, if I could get out of Serbia, Iran, whatever, that I would just be happy. But you're not going to be truly happy until you learn to be content. To learn to wait on God and trust God. And if God has you waiting in the wilderness for Saul to die before you can go sit on the throne, then that's the best place for you to be, is in the wilderness. Because some of the best lessons you'll ever learn is there in the wilderness waiting on Saul. Some of the best lessons you'll ever learn is when God has you just sitting down and waiting for your opportunity. I mean, you think about David for a minute. David, when we're first introduced to him, he gets to go to the king's palace. I mean, he's just a shepherd. He's a nobody. His own father doesn't even consider him worthy of bringing him in the room when Samuel comes to see who's going to be the next king. His father leaves him out there with the sheep because he says, if any of my children is not going to be the king, it's David. That's the kind of opinion people had of him. But even before he's anointed king, he gets to go into the king's palace and play music for Saul because he was so good of a musician that God exalted him to that level. But then think about that. He immediately goes back to taking care of the sheep. Can you imagine that? You get a taste of the king's palace, and then you have to go back to taking care of sheep, and then somebody shows up and tells you, hey, you're the king, by the way. God's already said, you're the king. And then you have to wait, not a short time. I mean, you wait a long time. You wait what seems like half your life just to finally get to sit on the throne and be the king that God said you would be. I mean, that sounds crazy. But you understand one thing that made David such a great king was all the waiting and all the trusting he had to learn to do with God. That's why I believe God called him a man after His own heart, because he learned in those times where he was sitting alone in the field just worshiping God. He learned really what God's heart was about. He learned to care about things the way God did, to think about things the way God did, to be more and more like our Savior. I think that's why, because he spent so much time just with God, waiting on God. I can say of myself, if there's any good thing about me, it's because God didn't let me get exalted to start with. He didn't just throw me up there that I was some great evangelist going around the country preaching and all that kind of crazy stuff. God let me start off very small, and I have never been someone that's so popular or famous or anything else. I've just been a preacher wherever God puts me, and I've tried to be faithful at it. And so if there's any good thing about me, it's because of the way God has handled trying to grow me. By starting me off small and never letting me get it bigger than what I am. Never letting me, just because I'll give an example. There's a fellow from my area that he was an evangelist. He was going around preaching in all these places. And everybody was just treating him like he was the greatest preacher who ever lived. And then all of a sudden, when he made one person mad who was powerful, they kicked his feet out from under him. He fell on his back and his whole life fell apart. And now he's one of the worst preachers I can think of. And you see, all of that happened because he got exalted way faster than what God wanted him to do. He did it man's way. I don't think he did it on purpose. I don't think anybody meant to do what they did. But you see that when we get ahead of God and we do it our way, the ends of man's ways are always going to be destruction. God doesn't add sorrow, but we do. God doesn't make mistakes, but we do. God doesn't mess things up, but we do. And so we do have to learn to trust God and do things in His time and His way. We have to learn to have that kind of faith that we're willing to wait on God, even when we're at a point where people are desperate, when people don't know what to do anymore. But I'm going to give you one great reason why you have to learn to wait on God before I close tonight. And that's because if you don't, you will miss God's answer. I've built this up. I've already laid all the foundation. There's not much more to say. Your answer will never be as good as God's answer. Whatever you come up with. If you've got a problem before you and you have to solve it, whatever your solution to fixing it is, will never be as good as God's. You've hurt somebody's feelings, you made them mad, and so you feel like you've got to get it fixed tonight. You have to send them 1,000 messages on Facebook and hope that they'll forgive you. It's not going to work. You're going to lose them. You're going to make them mad. You've got a bill to pay, and you don't know how you're going to pay it, and you feel like I've got to go, and I'll work on Sundays, I'll do whatever I have to do to get this bill paid. You're going to make yourself miserable. You're going to hurt your family. You're going to hurt everything around you. You're going to break your situation. You're desperate that you want a job, and so the first opportunity you get, you take it, and just assume it must be God's will. It's not going to work for you. You want a wife, and so, the first woman you meet, okay, I've got to marry her because she's the first one I met. She at least doesn't look like she's garbage, so I'll marry her. But it doesn't work that way. You will be miserable. You will, again, you may get by for a short time. You may be spiritual enough or intelligent enough that you'll make a few good decisions. But when you start going your way and stop trusting God and doing it your way, you will mess up. Eventually it will catch up to you, and you will at some point ruin your life. At some point you'll cause some problems that can't be undone. Think about this woman. She boiled her son and ate him. You can't undo that. The emotional damage that it has done to her cannot be undone. The loss of her child cannot be undone. It cannot be taken back. She made a decision, and it's going to affect her for the rest of her life. There is nothing that can ever change what she did. God can forgive her. He can have mercy on her. He can choose not to punish her. But what she did will never be undone, and the damage she caused to herself, her family, her home cannot be undone. That's exactly what God told David when He said that I forgive you. I'll not punish you for all this with Bathsheba and Uriah, but the sword will never depart from your house. The damage that David had done could never be undone. And so I'm telling you, not only will you miss God's answer, but you're going to get yourself in so much trouble trying to do it your way. Because your way is not the right way, God's way is. I think of another person in this story. If you go into chapter 7, I won't read it because I'm trying to finish up. But if you go into chapter 7, you read there's a man there. It says that the king leaned on him, that this was like the king's right-hand man. He trusted this guy. And when this guy talks to Elisha, and Elisha tells him that by this time tomorrow, God's going to bless in such a way that bread's going to be sold for this and this. That now instead of a donkey's head being worth 80 pieces of silver, a loaf of bread's going to be worth a penny. And the man laughs at Elijah, and he said, even if God opened the windows of heaven and poured it out, it couldn't happen. And so Elisha looks at him and says, because you didn't trust God, you'll see it, but you'll never taste it. You'll see it, you'll know that God did it, but you'll never get to have what God had in store for you. Because God had it in store for the whole city. This guy wasn't left off of the list. He put himself off of the list when he chose not to trust God and to mock at what God wanted to do. And you know what happens to him? When everybody starts running out of the city and he's standing there in the gate, he gets trampled, he gets killed, and then he's made an example. Because even Elisha says at the end of chapter 7, the Bible says that exactly what Elisha said would happen. That he saw it, he saw that there was so much food, he saw all the people getting filled, But he himself never got the taste of it because he got trampled by the people in the gate of the city. You understand that that's exactly why? I mean, I probably could have just preached that and just left the message at that. But I wanted to give you some other thoughts from Psalms tonight. I wanted to build some other ideas into this. But I could have left the message at this one simple thing. Why should you wait on God any longer? Well, first of all, what can you do if God doesn't answer? I mean, if God chooses not to give you what you want, if you go and get it yourself, do you really think it's going to be better? Do you really think that your solution is going to be better if He chooses to tell you to wait? If He chooses to tell you the answer is no? Do you really think that your plan and your desires are somehow going to make for a better life than what God tells you? But take it a step further. When you choose to do it your way, you are directly choosing to not do it God's way. You're directly choosing to reject whatever it is that God had in store for you because you choose that your way and your idea and your plan is somehow better than a holy God. And so what I'm telling you is just like that man who had everything before him, if he just would have trusted God, you miss out on it. Just like that woman who, had she waited one more day, God would have put so much bread that she couldn't have ate it all. But now she has to live with the consequences of her decision for the rest of her life. That's what happens when you get tired of waiting on God and you decide, okay, I'm not going to wait on Him any longer. I've waited long enough. I've waited for Him 3 days. My brother's been dead for too long. I don't even want to hear from him anymore. When you get to that kind of place where you're tired of waiting on God, you're done waiting, you want it and you want it now, you're not willing to give Him more time, what you do to yourself is you wind up like that woman that for the rest of your life you have to live with the decision. You have to live with the consequences of what you've done. You have to live with the fact that you've eaten your son and he's gone and there's nothing you can ever do about it. You have to live with the fact that you have made yourself a monster and there's nothing you can ever do to change that. You can be a good person for the rest of your life, but it's not going to change what you did. My point is quite simple. And for you and I, when it comes to us, and when we ask the question, why should I wait on God any longer? It could not be more simple than those two things. Because what can you do if God chooses not to answer? What could you ever do that if God chooses not to give you? I mean, all you're going to be doing is fighting against the holy God by trying to do it your way. And when you choose to do it your way instead of His way, you're directly rejecting the will of God. And so therefore, you're choosing to reject what He had in store for you to do it your way. And your way, man's ways, always end in death or destruction. God's ways are good and add no sorrow with them. Our ways bring nothing but trials and heartache and pain. So you have to ask yourself the question, is it really worth being like the woman that ate her child so that you can have it today? Or is it better to wait and trust God one more day? You know, that one more day may be 6 more months. It may be 6 more years. You may be at the point right now where you want the wife, you want the house, you want the car, you want all of that. And God may be saying you have to wait another 10, 20 years to get it. Is it going to be better to do it your way, or is it going to be better to wait on Him? That's the question you have to ask. I mean, David could have took the throne his way, but if David had took the throne in bloody violence like that and rejected the will of God, do you think he would have kept it? Do you think God would have gave it back to him if Absalom ever come along and took it? Do you think his reign, his time as king would have went half as good as it did? I don't think he would have had any of the things that he had. I don't think he would have been king for very long if he had decided to do it his way instead of God's. So you may get the house, you may get the car, you may get the wife, you may get the job, you may get whatever it is that you're waiting on, but you will not get the joy. You will not get the joy that comes with it, the peace of knowing that it was God's will. You won't get to enjoy any of it. It's like the man who said tonight, I'm gonna build my bigger barns, I'm gonna tear down the old ones, I'm gonna do all of this, and then God said, "Thou fool, tonight thy soul shall be required of thee." You can make the plans, you can do it all your way, all you want, but you will not get to enjoy it because you're fighting against God and there'll be no peace in it. You may have it, but you'll not get to enjoy it. You may get to see it, but you will not get to enjoy it.